I came home from a year studying abroad to find my own apartment lease had my sister's boyfriend's name on it. My job had been quit on my behalf 3 months earlier, and my own mother introduced me to her book club as the other twin before catching herself. That's the moment I understood something had gone deeply wrong while I was gone, and it took me the better part of a year to fully understand exactly how wrong. My name is Jordan, and my twin sister's name is Jamie. And this is the story of the year she quietly became me, one small decision at a time, while I was 7,000 miles away and completely unaware any of it was happening. I need to explain, before anything else, what Jamie and I were like before this happened, because I think people assume, when they hear identical twin steal sister's identity, some kind of dramatic, obviously sinister buildup, cartoonish and easy to see coming. Ours wasn't like that. For 26 years, Jamie and I had a genuinely close, if complicated, relationship. Close enough that people mixed us up constantly. Complicated enough that I think both of us, in different ways, spent our entire lives negotiating what it meant to be a distinct person while sharing a face with someone else. Jamie had always been, in certain specific ways, the less conventionally successful twin, though I hate framing it that way, because I don't think it was ever really about capability. I finished college a semester early, landed a solid job in marketing analytics at a mid-sized tech company, built a stable, if unglamorous life in the same city where we'd both grown up. Jamie had switched majors twice, worked a series of service industry jobs, moved apartments more times than I could accurately count, always seeming to be one unexpected expense away from real financial trouble. Our parents loved us both fiercely and, I think, equally, but I could tell, even without either of them saying it directly, that they worried about Jamie in a way they didn't worry about me. And I think that quiet, persistent worry shaped something in how Jamie saw herself against the backdrop of my more conventionally stable life. 18 months ago, I was accepted into a competitive one-year fellowship program based in Singapore, an opportunity that required me to essentially pause my entire life in the States, subletting my apartment, taking an unpaid leave from my job with the understanding I'd return to a comparable position afterward, temporarily stepping back from most of my regular routines and relationships while I focused on the program. I want to be honest that I made a decision, in preparing for that year abroad, that I now understand set the stage for everything that followed, though I had absolutely no way of predicting that at the time. Given the complexity of managing finances and paperwork across an international time difference, I gave Jamie limited power of attorney over specific practical matters, authority to handle my mail, communicate with my subletter if issues arose, and manage a few routine administrative tasks I anticipated needing handled while I was too far away and too differently scheduled to manage them myself in real time. I trusted Jamie with this, without a second thought, the same uncomplicated trust I'd extended to my twin sister for my entire life. I had no reason, at the time, to imagine that limited administrative authority would eventually be used as a foothold for something far more extensive. The fellowship program was intense, deliberately structured with minimal downtime and a demanding schedule that included significant technology restrictions during certain program phases, intended to encourage full immersion rather than constant connection back home. I spoke with my parents roughly every 2 weeks, brief calls constrained by the time difference and my limited availability, and with Jamie somewhat less frequently, occasional texts and the rare longer call when our schedules happened to align. I want to describe the first small sign that something was different, because in hindsight, it's almost painfully obvious, though at the time I dismissed it immediately as nothing significant. About 4 months into the program, my mother mentioned, during one of our biweekly calls, that she'd run into my old coworker, Denise, at the grocery store, and that Denise had asked how my new job was going. "What new job?" I asked, genuinely confused. "The one you started after leaving the marketing position," my mother said, sounding equally confused by my confusion. "Jamie mentioned you'd made a change a while back. Something about wanting a fresh start after the fellowship changed your perspective on things." I remember sitting in my small dorm-style apartment in Singapore, the time difference making it early morning there and late evening back home, feeling a strange, disorienting confusion that I initially attributed to simple miscommunication, some detail lost in the layers of secondhand information passing between me, Jamie, and our mother across enormous distance and time zones. "Mom, I haven't left my job. I'm on an approved leave of absence. I'm going back to the same position when I return." There was a pause on my mother's end that, looking back, I recognize now as the first small crack in a story that had apparently been quietly constructed without my knowledge. "Oh, I must have misunderstood something," Jamie said. "I'm sure it's just a mix-up on my end. Don't worry about it." I did worry about it, briefly, enough to send Jamie a text asking her to clarify what our mother might have misunderstood. Jamie's response came several hours later, breezy and casual. Huh. No idea. Mom gets details mixed up sometimes. You know how she is. Nothing to worry about. I want to be honest that I accepted this explanation far too easily, distracted by the demands of an intense fellowship program, operating on the reasonable, if ultimately mistaken, assumption that whatever confusion had occurred was minor and easily attributable to the ordinary imprecision of information passed along secondhand across a significant time difference. The next sign came about 2 months later, roughly 6 months into my year abroad, when I received an unexpected email from my apartment building's management office regarding updates to the current lease agreement, referencing a name I didn't recognize as a co-signer, a man named Trevor, whom I understood, from occasional mentions in Jamie's texts, to be her boyfriend of roughly a year. I called the management office directly, using the international calling feature on my phone despite the significant expense, genuinely alarmed now in a way the earlier grocery store mix-up hadn't quite triggered. I'm calling about my apartment lease. I received an email about updates involving a co-signer I don't recognize. Can you explain what's happening? The property manager, after verifying my identity, explained something that made my stomach drop in a way I still remember vividly. According to our records, you requested a lease modification about 4 months ago, adding a co-signer while transitioning the unit to what you described as a family member sublet arrangement during your extended time abroad. The modification was processed with what appeared to be your standard authorization. I never requested that, I said, my voice rising despite my attempt to stay calm. I have a subletter already in place, someone completely different from the person you're describing. The property manager, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking, offered to escalate the issue for further review, though she was careful to note that the request had come through channels that, at the time, appeared entirely legitimate, an email account under my name, communications that referenced accurate details about my apartment and lease history that would have been difficult for a random stranger to know. I called Jamie immediately after hanging up with the property manager, my hands genuinely shaking despite the significant time difference, meaning it was the middle of the night back home. She didn't answer. I called again, 3 more times over the following hour, before finally sending a text so direct I couldn't imagine her being able to deflect it any further. I just found out someone modified my apartment lease using my identity. Explain what is happening right now. Her response, when it finally came the following morning her time, was the beginning of an unraveling that took months to fully understand. Okay, I can explain. Please don't freak out. I've just been helping manage some things while you're gone, and it got a little more complicated than I planned. Can we video call when you have time? This isn't really something I want to explain over text. That video call, when we finally managed to schedule it around our significant time difference, was one of the most disorienting conversations of my entire life. Jamie, visibly nervous in a way I'd rarely seen from her, slowly revealed a pattern of decisions that had apparently accumulated over the preceding 6 months into something far more extensive than either of us had anticipated when I first gave her that limited administrative authority. It had started, according to Jamie's explanation, with genuinely practical intentions. My original subletter, a graduate student named Alicia, had backed out unexpectedly about 2 months into my time abroad, leaving Jamie, who had access to communicate with my building management under our original arrangement, to scramble for a replacement solution rather than let the apartment sit empty and my sublease income lapse. Rather than fully consulting me, a decision she attributed, during that call, to not wanting to burden me with logistics during an intensive program phase where she knew my availability was limited, she had decided to move into the apartment herself, along with Trevor, presenting the arrangement to the building management as an approved family sublet given her limited but genuine power of attorney. I want to be clear that this initial decision, while definitely overstepping the boundaries of what I'd actually authorized, wasn't yet the full scope of what had happened. If Jamie had stopped there, moving into my apartment temporarily, even without fully consulting me, while covering the rent responsibly, I think I could have eventually processed that as an overstep born of genuine practical pressure rather than something more troubling. What actually happened, over the following months, was considerably more extensive. Living in my apartment, using my name for the lease arrangement, appeared to have created a kind of momentum that pulled Jamie further into a pattern of decisions made under my identity rather than her own. When my job's HR department reached out, during month 4 of my leave, with a routine check-in email about my anticipated return date, Jamie, who apparently had access to my personal email through details she'd needed for the original apartment arrangement, had responded, using language crafted to sound like me, indicating I decided not to return to the position, citing the fellowship as having shifted my career priorities. I sat with that detail for a long, stunned silence during our call, trying to process the fact that my actual employment, a genuine, stable position I fully intended to return to, had been effectively terminated by my sister, using my own voice and identity, without my knowledge or consent. "Why would you do that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you make that decision for me?" Jamie's explanation, delivered through what appeared to be genuine tears by that point in our call, revealed something I hadn't fully understood about her state of mind throughout the preceding months. "I don't know, Jordan. It's like once I started handling things as you, it just kept feeling easier to keep doing it that way rather than untangling everything and explaining the mess I'd already made. And there was this other part of it too, that I'm embarrassed to even say out loud. For once, people were treating me the way they always treated you. Trevor's family loved me. The building manager was impressed with my stable job history when we negotiated the lease terms. I know how messed up that sounds. I just kept telling myself I'd untangle it all before you actually got back. And then more time would pass, and untangling it felt harder every single week instead of easier. I want to try to convey the specific, vertiginous horror of learning that your twin sister had spent months essentially living inside a stolen version of your identity. Not out of malice exactly, but out of some tangled combination of practical pressure, genuine insecurity about her own life, and a momentum that apparently became easier to continue than to stop and honestly confront. I asked her, during that same call, how far the deception had actually extended, bracing myself for whatever additional revelations might still be coming. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, and I could tell, even across the distance and the delayed video connection, that she was working up the nerve to admit something else. "There's more," she said. "I need you to know about the credit card." She explained, haltingly, that roughly 5 months into my time abroad, using details she'd needed for the original apartment arrangement, she had opened a new credit card under my identity, ostensibly to help cover unexpected costs associated with furnishing the apartment for herself and Trevor, fully intending, she insisted, to pay it off before I ever needed to know it existed. The balance, by the time she finally confessed to it during that call, had climbed to just over $11,000, spread across furniture, several vacations she and Trevor had taken together, and a growing list of smaller, harder-to-categorize purchases that had apparently accumulated over months of treating the card as an extension of a life she'd started to think of, in some confused, complicated way, as at least partially her own. I remember sitting in stunned silence, watching my sister's face on a laggy video call from 7,000 miles away, trying to process that I now potentially carried $11,000 of debt I'd never authorized, tied to my credit history, my financial future, my ability to eventually secure loans or leases of my own once I finally returned home. "I'll pay it back," Jamie said quickly, seeing my expression even through the poor connection. "I promise, I'll figure out how to pay every bit of it back. I just didn't know how to tell you, and every month that passed without telling you made it feel harder to bring up." The full scope of what had happened during my year away took weeks to fully untangle. Once I returned home 3 months earlier than my original planned return date, cutting the final stretch of my fellowship program short to deal with the unraveling mess Jamie's decisions had created. My apartment lease, my job status, even several smaller financial accounts Jamie had apparently accessed using details she'd needed for the original limited authority I'd granted her, all needed to be carefully audited, corrected, and in some cases, formally disputed with the relevant institutions. My job, thankfully, was recoverable, though it required an uncomfortable, extensive conversation with HR explaining the actual circumstances, along with documentation proving the resignation email hadn't genuinely come from me. My former manager, sympathetic once she understood the full situation, agreed to bring me back into a comparable position, though the entire process delayed my return to full employment by nearly 2 additional months beyond what I'd originally planned. The apartment situation was messy. Jamie and Trevor had, by the time I returned, been living in my apartment for nearly 8 months, building what felt, from the outside, like an entire domestic life inside a lease that legally still belonged to me, under an identity Jamie had increasingly blurred into her own throughout that extended period. I gave them 30 days to find alternative housing, a boundary I felt was firm but fair given everything that had happened, though enforcing even that reasonable timeline required an uncomfortable, tense series of conversations that strained our relationship in ways I don't think either of us has fully recovered from, even now, more than a year later. Resolving the credit card debt took considerably longer and involved a formal fraud dispute process with the card issuer, along with an uncomfortable conversation with a fraud investigator who needed to understand the specific family dynamics involved before determining how to categorize what had technically, legally occurred. I remember sitting across from that investigator, a tired-looking man who had clearly handled this exact configuration of family betrayal more times than either of us wanted to acknowledge, trying to explain that yes, my sister had opened this account. Yes, we were identical twins, which complicated some of the standard identity verification questions. And no, I hadn't authorized any of it despite the family relationship involved. The investigator ultimately classified the situation as unauthorized account activity, allowing me to dispute the debt formally. Though the process required Jamie to provide a signed, notarized statement acknowledging her role, an uncomfortable document that took nearly 3 additional weeks to finalize given how reluctant she initially was to put the full admission in writing, even after having already confessed everything to me directly. Eventually, facing the alternative of the debt remaining permanently on my credit history, she agreed, and the account was formally closed and the balance forgiven by the issuer once fraud was confirmed, though the entire process left a temporary mark on my credit report that took several additional months to fully clear even after the dispute was resolved in my favor. I want to describe the specific, strange grief of confronting my mother about the other twin comment, the moment during my first family dinner back home that finally, fully revealed how completely Jamie's extended impersonation had blurred the boundaries between us in the eyes of people who had known us both our entire lives. My mother, mortified once she realized her mistake, explained that over the preceding months, Jamie had increasingly introduced herself using slight variations of my name in social contexts. Jordan Jamie, she'd apparently taken to saying, as a kind of half-joking hybrid, in situations connected to my old job, my apartment building. Even at a dentist appointment Jamie had attended under my insurance information, citing convenience given how similar we apparently still looked despite years of subtle differences developing between us since childhood. I genuinely started losing track of which version of events was real, my mother admitted, during a difficult, tearful conversation we had shortly after my return. Jamie would mention something about your job or your apartment, and I'd just believe her, the same way I always have. I had no idea how much of what she was telling me wasn't actually happening to you at all. I confronted Jamie directly about the specific decision to blur our identities so extensively. Beyond even the practical necessities of managing the apartment and job situation, needing to understand whether any part of what happened had been deliberate, calculated deception, or whether it truly was, as she continued to insist, an accumulation of smaller decisions that had simply spiraled beyond her control. I think it started as convenience, she told me, during one of several difficult conversations we had over the following months. But somewhere along the way, it became something else. I think I genuinely wanted, for a while, to know what it felt like to be you, to see what people actually treated Jordan like when I was the one standing in that space instead of always just being Jamie, Jordan's sister. That's an awful thing to admit. I know it's an awful thing to admit, but I think it's the honest answer, and you deserve the honest answer, even though I know it doesn't actually fix anything. I don't fully know, even now, more than a year removed from all of this, exactly how to feel about that admission. I understand, intellectually, the particular pain of always existing in some family and social contexts, as the less conventionally successful twin, defined in relation to a sibling rather than as a fully distinct person in her own right. I have genuine sympathy for that specific, lifelong wound, even as I remain deeply, permanently unsettled by the specific way Jamie chose to address it, not by building her own distinct, separate identity and success, but by temporarily, extensively occupying mine. Our relationship, in the time since, has settled into something considerably more distant and cautious than what we shared before this happened. We still talk, occasionally, still show up for major family events, still maintain the basic, functional connection that comes from being twins with the same parents and the same 26 years of shared history preceding all of this. But the easy, uncomplicated trust one extended to her without a second thought before my year abroad simply doesn't exist anymore, replaced by something more careful, more guarded, the kind of relationship that requires conscious, ongoing effort rather than the effortless closeness we shared for most of our lives. I've since become considerably more careful about the specific mechanics of trust and authority I extend to anyone, even close family, understanding now, in a way I genuinely didn't before, how quickly limited, reasonable permission can be gradually expanded into something far more extensive, especially when the person granted that permission is dealing with their own unaddressed insecurities about their place relative to the person who trusted them. I've also started, slowly, working through some of this in therapy, specifically trying to understand my own role in the family dynamic that apparently made Jamie feel, for her entire life, defined primarily in relation to me rather than as a fully separate person. I don't think I caused what she did. I want to be completely clear about that, because I think it would be easy, in processing something this disorienting, to slide into a kind of misplaced guilt that doesn't actually belong to me. But I do think our family, in ways none of us fully intended, spent years subtly reinforcing a dynamic where I was implicitly treated as the stable twin and Jamie as the struggling one. And I think that dynamic, compounding over 26 years, created exactly the kind of pressure that made temporarily occupying my identity feel, to her, like some kind of relief rather than the serious violation it actually was. Trevor and Jamie broke up about 4 months after everything came apart, a detail I only learned secondhand through my mother, who still, cautiously, maintains a relationship with both of them despite everything. I don't know the specific reasons for their breakup, and I've made a deliberate choice not to ask, understanding that my own healing doesn't particularly benefit from continued, detailed awareness of the specific texture of the life Jamie built while occupying mine. If you've ever discovered that someone close to you had quietly taken over parts of your life while you weren't watching closely enough, I want to hear how you found your way through untangling it afterward. I used to believe that twins share a kind of automatic, unbreakable understanding that makes this sort of betrayal essentially unthinkable between us. I've learned, in the most disorienting way possible, that shared blood and shared history don't actually protect against someone else's unresolved insecurities finding an opportunity, however unintentionally created, to quietly, gradually take the shape of your own life instead of building their own.